Welcome. Today's lecture is going to be on informal fallacies. You can remember different kinds or inductive, the nature of inductive arguments, right? So inductive arguments are not valid, meaning that they don't guarantee their conclusion. True premises does not mean that the conclusion is certain to be true, but a good inductive argument does make the conclusion more plausible, more likely than not. Good inductive arguments are strong, which means that their premises actually make their conclusions more likely when true. And good inductive arguments are cogent. So the best kind of inductive argument is a cogent one, and a cogent argument is both strong and it has true premises. There are three different kinds of inductive argument that we discussed. First is sort of enumerative induction, where you start off with a series of cases that tend to go one way, like all swans that I've seen are white, and then you make a generalization on the basis of those cases, right? If all the swans I've seen have been white, then it seems like maybe all swans are white. Then there's the case of argument by analogy, where you take something that you know well and you say, look, okay, this thing has property X, Y, and Z, and this new thing has property X and Y, so it seems likely that it would also have property Z. And then finally, abduction or inference to the best explanation is the kind of argument where you compare all the possible explanations of a particular phenomena, and then by a certain metric, like whether or not it coheres with all the other things you know, or whether or not it has more evidence than not, you can determine which explanation is actually the best one. The kinds of inductive arguments that tend to fail often tend to do so for three different kinds of reasons. Sometimes even deductive arguments fail for these kinds of reasons, but we're looking mostly at inductive arguments. And the three different kinds of reasons are basically located in issues with the premises. And the three different kinds of issues that the premises might have are that, in the first place, they might be unacceptable in one sense or another. In another case, the premises might be simply irrelevant to the conclusion of an argument, or the premises might be insufficient for showing that the conclusion is actually likely. First, let's discuss unacceptable premises. You might think of this as a form of argumentative punting. So premises for an argument that are unacceptable are basically when the premise is in some way problematic or unbelievable, or it doesn't have as much evidence going for it as the conclusion itself that it's supposed to back up. So if you have a conclusion that you're trying to show is true, and then you appeal to something just as wildly unbelievable as the conclusion that you're trying to back up, then you've punted, basically. You've tried to explain something or argue for something by appealing to something that is simply just as mysterious or just as problematic or just as difficult to believe than the thing you're arguing for. One example that often gets trotted out here is the case of like biblical inerrancy. So you may have heard of someone argue that the Bible is true because it's the written word of God. And maybe it is, but when asked why someone believes that the Bible is true or that the Bible is written by God, someone might claim, well, because the Bible tells us that it's written by God. And that's sort of, why should you believe that? It seems like now you've trapped yourself in a kind of circle. The person that's questioning whether or not the Bible is true in the first place isn't going to accept that the Bible says that it's written by God, that's true just because it's in there. So here the idea is that, if you don't believe the first thing to begin with, the second thing is just as unbelievable. And so trying to back up the first claim with the second is to sort of beg the question against the person. It is worth explaining. The notion of begging the question often gets confused. When you beg the question against someone, you are trying to argue for a particular conclusion, and then you offer as a premise or evidence for that argument something that the person that you're arguing with doesn't accept to begin with. And that's that's a problematic form of argument. If you're trying to prove something to someone, you can't give them evidence that they already reject, right? This is like, one other thing that's sort of worth recognizing here, though, right, is in this particular case, is that it's not just because of this kind of argument that you might think that the Bible actually states truths or falsehoods. There are other claims that are worthy of consideration, like historiography and questions of who wrote what, when, and why, that could, lead us to think, oh, okay, yeah, this part of the Bible is true, whereas to other parts, maybe more difficult to believe that. Another kind of argument with unacceptable premises is the kind of argument expressed by a false dilemma. And a false dilemma is the kind of argument where someone gives you a premise for a conclusion that is, either this or this, right? It's like an either this or that, when there's lots more options available. So here's like some simple examples that you may have run into, right? A parent telling a child that if they don't go to college, they'll end up living in a van down by the river. Obviously, that's a false dilemma. If you don't go to college, there are lots of other available job paths that can lead to success, right? You don't have to either go to college or live in a van down by the river, even if that sounds appealing. Similarly, more recent topical version of this argument has been laid out when people kneel during the national anthem in protest, and the thought of the argument is that if you don't stand during the national anthem, then you hate our country, or something like that, right? That's a false dilemma, because there's lots of intermediate positions that one might take and other reasons one might not stand during the national anthem. Here's a sort of more interesting case of something like begging the question, but it's actually more philosophically relevant. It was kind of a punt. So there's this philosopher, René Descartes, who has this theory of sort of the soul. He thinks that the mind or the soul is distinct from the body, and basically he argues for this point by saying that the mind can't be a material thing, while he accepts that the brain itself and the body itself are material things. But then when pressed on how it's possible for the mind to in some way control or causally interact with the body, he also accepts that the only kinds of things that physically cause other things are physical. So he has to punt, in a way, to an explanation that appeals to a special kind of interaction between minds and bodies. And so in his theory, he has to assume that there's something over and above just the mind and the body. There's the mind, there's the body, and there's this special interaction stuff. The problem here is that it's less acceptable, right? It's the kind of thing that you have to, it strains the the plausibility of the argument if you appeal to something mysterious in order to explain something that's already mysterious, right? So here what Descartes is doing is explaining how the mind and the body actually interact by appealing to something more mysterious in the first place. Another kind of informal fallacy is a fallacy of irrelevant premises. There's lots of different kinds of fallacies of irrelevant premises that one might appeal to, but the basic idea is that in the argument, the way that the premises are presented may be trying to sort of trick you in a certain way into accepting them, but as it turns out, the premises are ultimately irrelevant to the conclusion and don't actually make the conclusion more likely than not at all. The fallacy of equivocation, or also called the fallacy of ambiguity, is when the premises of an argument only, like they depend on the fact that a certain word means two things, and then you run them together. Oftentimes there are jokes that work along these lines, and they are funny, but they don't work very well as arguments. Here's a really dumb example, right? Premise 1, trees have different kinds of bark. Premise 2, dogs have different kinds of bark. Conclusion, therefore, trees and dogs both have bark. Of course, here we're running on the different meanings of the word bark to get the first two premises to come out true, and then we're equivocating between the two meanings in order to support the conclusion. Most arguments are that use equivocation are much more salacious or sort of difficult to spot than this, but this one is sort of an easy example. Two other common kinds of informal fallacy are the fallacy of composition and division. Under this type of fallacy, oftentimes what is true of the whole is assumed to somehow apply to the parts, or vice versa, right? So in a fallacy of composition, usually you say something like, look, all of the members of the Supreme Court are hungry, so the Supreme Court is hungry. I mean, that's like a joke, right? Because it's not possible for a court to be hungry. But you can understand like what I'm saying here, right? But if you were to use this in the form of an argument, you might run afoul of the composition fallacy. Similarly, for division, right? Just because some large thing has a property does not mean that each of its parts has that property. So, for example, suppose the energy company has been found at fault for the electrical fire that's caused by the down power lines. So, you assume that each of the employees is somehow worthy of blame for the damage caused. Now, that seems ultimately just problematic as an argument. There might be some employees that do deserve blame, but each of the employees, like you can't go from the entire company is at fault to each individual that makes up the company is at fault. An ad hominem fallacy is when someone appeals to some kind of property of the person making the argument in order to somehow try and show that the argument is false, implausible, problematic in some way. A sort of example of this was Donald Trump during the presidential debates called Hillary Clinton a nasty woman, and then tried to imply that because of that her views were unacceptable or something like that. Now this kind of happens often just because someone has a character flaw, even if they do, right? If someone has been to prison because they committed some crime, and now they're making an argument, right? They're arguing that people should have the right to vote. And you say, like prisoners, maybe they're arguing prisoners should have the right to vote. And you say, well, you committed a crime, so I don't have a good reason to believe you. That would be a problematic version of an ad hominem argument. You're just maligning the person as if their argument doesn't even matter anymore. The genetic fallacy, or the fallacy of origin, is when you reason that something is true simply on the basis of where it comes from. So take the sort of recent case that just because some claim comes out of the CDC means that it must be true for treating COVID, right? So initially the CDC gave a bunch of mixed messages on the effectiveness of mask usage at the beginning of the pandemic. That is, just because the CDC says it doesn't always mean necessarily that it's true. So you have to be careful about just because something came from somewhere doesn't necessarily mean it's true. You need to actually check the reliability of the information itself. Akin to the genetic fallacy are a number of fallacies where one appeals to something in order to back up a claim. Now, each of these, again, is a fallacy where the premises are ultimately irrelevant to the conclusion because the thing that is appealed to doesn't actually mean or make the claim at interest true. First, we have the appeal to authority, and I have a picture of Joe Rogan, sort of as a joke, right? Because people tend to appeal to people that are authorities in order to back up some claim. And this is actually acceptable more often than not, as long as the person is actually an authority on the claim, right? So you might say, like, hey, 9 out of 10 doctors recommend this drug for treating this disease. Well, that seems like you're appealing to an authority, and that seems like a good one. But if you appeal to, Joe Rogan for medical advice, well, he's not an actual authority in this case. Maybe he's talked with authorities, but that doesn't mean that he's an authority. So appealing to what he says is not a good a good reason to believe something. Similarly, appealing to the masses. So we've got this sort of restaurant scene here. Just because everyone is doing something doesn't mean it's the right thing to do. You can imagine, right? So like an example in the past is like a lot of people own slaves. That doesn't make it morally acceptable. And something that's possible in the future is, the possibility that at some point we all look back and think, wow, I can't believe that all those people just ate meat all the time, right? It's possible that in the future we all become vegetarians for ethical reasons or something along those lines. And just because everyone or lots of people nowadays believe that it's fine to kill and eat animals doesn't mean that it actually is. Two other forms of appeal fallacies, or sort of one is appealing to a form of tradition here, right? So just because the Catholic Church has operated in the same way for a very long time doesn't mean that they have some sort of authority over certain kinds of statements. Similarly, just because the tradition of slavery was continued for so long doesn't make it all right. You can't appeal to something just because it's been the way that things have operated up till now to say, to make the claim that the thing is actually acceptable to continue. The action is acceptable to continue, or to make it true. The idea here is just being that the fact that the particular activity is a tradition that has been undertaken doesn't make it more or less okay, right? The traditional aspect of it is just a fact about it. It doesn't add anything to an argument that's, saying that like slavery is fine, right? Appeal to ignorance is another kind of appealing fallacy, but this one works in two different ways. You might appeal to someone's lack of proof so that, by saying like, hey, look, you can't prove that God exists, and so there must be the case that there's no God, right? No, the lack of evidence, the lack of the ability to prove something doesn't mean that thing doesn't exist, right? Similarly, you might appeal to the lack of disproof, right? You might say, look, you can't disprove, you haven't been able to disprove that Bigfoot exists, and so he must exist. Like neither of these cases, just because we are ignorant about something doesn't mean that doesn't lend support to these kinds of conclusions. Mere ignorance is not a good reason for believing something or disbelieving something. And finally, among the appealing fallacies, we have the appeal to fear. Oftentimes this gets bandied about in like court maybe, or something where you'd say, look, if you don't convict, this person is just going to go out there and do it again, right? Where the conviction is whether or not they actually are guilty in the first place. So appealing, just because someone can make you afraid doesn't mean that they're guilty, right? Similarly, you'd be like, vote for me because I'm going to be the best president. And if you don't vote for me, then you're going to like end up in communist Russia or something like that, right? Like that's an attempt to call on people's fears in order to get them to accept some claim. The strawman fallacy is actually a rather common argumentative position that people take, especially if you watch Fox News or any kind of political banter. And what happens in a straw man argument is that someone sets up a kind of easy position for their opponent that they can knock down, right? So what they do is they kind of falsely paint their opponent as holding to what is usually seen as some kind of obviously problematic view, and then say, hey, okay, that thing is, so and then they just blast them for it. This happens if you watch the Ben Shapiro when he destroys people on YouTube. So like an example here is somebody that says like, look, okay, Biden supports abortion rights, Joe Biden does, so Joe Biden supports the murdering of innocent children. Clearly, that's not exactly right. He doesn't support the murdering of innocent children, but to sort of set up the idea of abortion rights as the murdering of innocent children is to set up the straw man to be able to knock it over, right? It's obvious, like nobody wants to support the murdering of innocent children, right? And so if you can paint someone as supporting that, then clearly they have a problem. The final set of informal fallacies that we'll talk about in this lecture are the sort that involve insufficient premises. Now, previously, so irrelevant premises are cases in which the premises don't actually sort of lend any credence to the argument because you're sort of appealing to something outside of the scope of the argument in order to try and garner support. Whereas insufficient premises, usually there's something in the vicinity that's sort of right, but the premises that are appealed to are insufficient to sort of actually show or prove or make plausible or make probable the conclusions that they're supposed to be supporting. The hasty generalization we've talked a little bit about previously. It's sort of the most obvious form of insufficient informal fallacy, insufficient premise for inductive arguments. So remember like the case of seeing 1,000 white swans, and so making the claim that all swans are white. Well, ultimately, that would be a hasty generalization, just assuming that there's millions and millions of swans in the world. So having seen 1,000 doesn't give you a sufficient number of cases upon which to make that claim, right? So because, and then ultimately the claim that all swans are white is false because there are black swans. When you make a hasty generalization, you just make a general claim. You claim something general on the basis of a small number of cases. If the number of cases is too small, then you've done it. You've sort of gone too fast in making your generalization. Now, it's worth pointing out that weak inductive arguments are acceptable. Remember, a weak inductive argument is an inductive argument where the premises don't make the conclusion likely. But more often than not, weak inductive arguments, they're not, like, as long as the premises aren't irrelevant to the conclusion, they do lend some support, right? So for each individual swan that you see that's white, that lends some support to the claim that all swans are white. Right, and then it's just the fact that one black swan that you see all of a sudden goes the other direction. But so weak inductive arguments are sort of acceptable for incrementally increasing the plausibility or possibility or probability, I guess, of a conclusion. But they're just not good arguments, where a good inductive argument needs to be strong, needs to actually make the conclusion more plausible or probable than not. Another thing that's worth recognizing is hasty generalizations are the kinds of things that we do all the time, right? Like you bought a Ford and it broke down on you a bunch of times, so you all of a sudden think, Fords are bad cars. Well, you don't know that because you only had one example, and you might have just gotten that one bad car. But we can, while we do reason this way quite often, there is sort of a move that you can make that takes you out of reasoning poorly and into a more, relatively good realm, where you move from thinking, in the generalization, like all to most, right? So maybe instead of thinking all swans are white, you could say, oh, well, most swans are white, right? That lessens the claim. It's still a general claim, but it's not as strong of a claim. And then, if you realize that you're still making a hasty generalization because your claim is based on too small a number of cases, you might move from most to, well, at least most around here, right? And that's how the people should have reasoned initially in the swans case, right? They shouldn't have thought all swans are white. They should have thought, well, all the swans around here are white. In cases of reasoning by analogy, you can run afoul of having a bad analogy, right? Having a bad analogy is just when you try to compare two different things, but and then and when you're claiming, oh, this further thing, it's likely that the thing that I'm comparing it to also has this further property. Well, it depends. You can always find things that are similar between two individual objects or actions or something like that. However, you also need to make sure that the differences between the two things aren't insignificant, or are insignificant, right? Aren't significant differences. So, like, for example, the ancient aliens hypothesis. One of the things that they found is that the Mayans have these like sculptures, and some of the sculptures tend to kind of look like astronauts, right? And so the thought is that, well, this lends credence to the idea that there were astronauts that touched down, thousands and thousands of years ago, and that the Mayans were just kind of copying these things. But so just because a spacesuit looks like that, and just because a figurine from the Mayan times looks like that, doesn't give you a good reason to analogize to, oh, they must look this way because they're both spacemen, right? The differences between these two cases are significant enough to make this a bad analogy. Correlation and causation, or post hoc reasoning, is quite common as well, and also problematic. Post hoc usually just means sort of like after the fact, right? So when one thing happens first and then another thing happens, and then you reason that because one happened before the other, that it must have been the cause. That happens sort of a lot, and it's highly problematic unless you have some actual causal information that you're sort of counting on, right? Like the classic one here is that night follows day, and so day must cause night, or something like that, or the other way around, right? Day follows night, and so night somehow must cause the day. That's crazy, right? We know now, that it's the sun rising that causes day, and the sun setting that causes night, and it has to do with the rotation of the Earth, right? So this gets more complicated, and we'll talk about this later in the class as well. But there are lots of different instances of correlation taken for causation, and forms of reasoning that get bandied about along these lines. So take, for example, the gambler's fallacy. The gambler's fallacy happens when, if you're gambling and you've been losing, right, because you've been betting on red, and every time, right, the roulette table, you spin it and it keeps landing on black, and you're like, okay, well, it's landed on black the last 10 times, so it's got to land on red this time, right? And the idea being that somehow, just because the last 10 times it went one way, makes it more probable that it's going to land on what you're betting on this next time. when the actual fact of the matter is, no, it's just as probable this next time that it's going to land on either, it's like 50-50 shot, right? Or on a real roulette table, I guess it's just less than 50-50 that it'll land on black or red. Another example of this sort of correlation and causation thing, every, I don't know, probably at least once a year, there's always a study that comes out on the one hand that says that eggs are bad for you and cause heart problems or high cholesterol. And then there's another another study that comes out that says eggs are great for you, right? And so the question is always like, well, what are you supposed to do? Well, one thing you might think, and this is, at least a little bit of speculation on my part, but you might think that these are, this is correlation. There's certainly going to be correlation between eggs and heart problems in certain populations, right? Namely, the people that when they eat eggs, they also eat bacon, right? And because there's definitely causation there between certain kinds of animal meat byproducts and, hardening of your arteries. So in those kinds of cases, you might think like, okay, look, there's correlation between eggs and an actual cause of heart cardiovascular issues. And because of that, people may be jumping to the conclusion that eggs are part of the cause. Finally, the last informal fallacy we're talking about today are slippery slope fallacies. And the slippery slope fallacy often gets used, again, by politicians or people that are interested in certain kinds of moral arguments, where usually you say something or some action is going to lead down a path to some much worse thing that happens. And of course, if things continue, then it will go down that path. But simply one particular thing does not necessarily make the really bad thing always happen, right? So examples in recent history have been people arguing that if gay marriage gets legalized, then that's just one step closer to people being allowed to marry their animals, right? Their pets or something like that, which is a hilarious argument. People in even more recent times arguing that free COVID vaccines is just going to lead to universal health care. I would actually love that to put my political cards on the table, but it's, there are some people that think that would be the end of the world if everyone had health care. And then similarly, right, that government assistance in hard times of hardship is just going to lead to communism. Again, these are slippery slope arguments. That just because the first thing happens doesn't mean that the second thing is inevitable. All right, that brings us to the end of this lecture for this week. Next week is going to be the midterm, and so I suggest that you review the material here, review the quizzes that you've taken. There won't be any kind of study guide for the exam because the exam is going to be sort of long format. You'll have plenty of time, multiple days to work on the exam, and so you'll have plenty of time to look back and try and figure out the answers to each of these questions. And I highly suggest that you go and practice doing the material from last week, the deductive arguments, go into the reading and pick out some of the examples and actually go over them. I posted a video where I discuss how to accomplish or to answer each of these questions. And that's it. Good luck.